Again, I'm thankful for the opportunity to be with you all. I'm thankful for the invitation, Matt reaching out to me a little over a year ago and knowing this day was going to come and being able to see so many familiar faces. A lot of people who I used to worship with back home. The Smiths are here. The Stringers, Dalila and the kids are here. Y'all recently, this is a long-term borrow is what I'm calling it. But Dave and Heather Hamlet just moved here. And it's not permanent. I want to be clear. But I get it. You know, Mara and Gavin, they have a sweet little cute baby Isla, and you know, it does what it does to people, I guess. But they're an absolute blessing. They were huge for us, for me, for Heather and I personally, in a lot of different ways, a lot of different facets. Dave's a man I look up to, and I know that he's going to be great here, and he's going to do a lot of good work here. And so your great gain are tremendous loss back home. Also, he loves affirmation, by the way, especially publicly, so this is great. He hates it. If your life ended today, would you go to heaven? To that fair land I'm on my way, where the soul of man never dies. You just sang that. Did you mean it? Dear friends, there will be no sad farewells. There will be no tear-dimmed eyes, where all is peace and joy and love. And the soul of man never dies. If your life ended today, is that where you would spend the rest of eternity? I want to be clear, for the lesson this morning, my hope is actually to encourage you, to have confidence in that. I think too often, here's what happens to Christians, is that Christians think about heaven. Let me rephrase that. Christians don't think about heaven as often as they should. But when they think about heaven, they think about it as a place that they'll probably never get to. You'll never admit it, but deep down inside, there's a little bit of fear that if God came back today, probably not me. You know what I mean? Other people maybe. Those real good spiritual people who the super Christians, them probably. But probably not me. This weekend we've been talking about standing firm. And standing firm in the Lord. And looking at the schemes and the wiles of the evil one, the one that we're fighting against. And I'm not sure there's a tactic that he has, a weapon that he has that's stronger than that, than the doubt of God's grace, the doubt of God's promises, and the doubt of that land that we just sang about. We just read in Revelation chapter 9. We won't reread all these verses, but we read about this land that exists. This land where people are singing praises to God and to the Lamb. And it actually seems like, at least in Revelation 7, it's God's people that start the worship, and then the angels join in. They hear our song. They hear our song of salvation, our song of God's praise, and they decide to join along. That these people are described as those who have suffered for the Lord. And because they lost their lives in the Lord, they ultimately get to be with Him for forever. That they live to serve God perfectly. Not flawed like we do here, but they live to serve God perfectly day and night. That they're described as people who have been saved and have been washed by the blood of the Lamb. That in the scenes of heaven, at least in the book of Revelation, Revelation gives us in Revelation 4 and 5, in chapter 7, chapter 14, depending on how you want to view it, 21 and 22, you get these glimpses of that land. And it gets described as a garden. It gets described as a tabernacle. It gets described as a temple, as a holy city. That all these things that we talked about in the first lesson, all these things are just shadows, they're glimpses of this land. Do you believe that you would be there if your life ended? Like if the Lord came right now. Some of you might be thinking during this lesson, I really wish He came, but that if God just came now, do you believe that you would spend eternity with Him? With the Father, with His Son, with the Spirit? That after all this tribulation, after all this wandering here, that you would have an eternal abode with God. This morning, for this last lesson, I want us to look at the voices of the spies. If you have your Bibles, you can go to Numbers chapter 13. We're going to be in Numbers 13 and 14 for the majority of the lesson. In Numbers 13 and 14, this is going to kind of be how we're going to look at the lesson, kind of just a little roadmap so you know what we're going to be. But we're going to start by looking at the report of the 12 spies, or the 12 leaders is what they're actually called, is what they actually are. And we'll look at what happens to the nation of Israel. They're actually a nation, a people susceptible to voices, and we'll finish off with just an admonition and encouragement to listen to the voice of God and see what the voice of God is telling us. Whenever you read the New Testament, Paul writes in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 that whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instructions, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the scriptures we might have hope. And so again, the purpose of this lesson is to encourage you, to open your eyes to what the enemy does against you, but really to give you hope. Because there's a lot of similarities between us and the nation of Israel, at least at this point in time. So just for a little bit of context, and we looked at it a little bit in Deuteronomy 8, but in Numbers chapter 13, which is the book, before it, but in Numbers 13, the people, they were on Sinai, they've come down Sinai, they're in Kadesh now, they're getting ready to enter into the promised land, and you have all this anticipation. If you are the nation of Israel, what you have again is you have a nation of people who have been enslaved for generations and have been liberated from the reluctant grip of their captor. They had a slave master who did not want to let them go. And when you read the book of Exodus, what the text says is that they're then, and Paul recites this, at least in 1 Corinthians 10, they're baptized through water, the Red Sea, but they're baptized through water. And then they're led in the wilderness by a man that they had once rejected, and ended up becoming their unexpected deliverer. Does that sound familiar, by the way? Does that story sound familiar? Obviously, I'm talking about the nation of Israel, but that's Christianity. That's your story as well. That we were a people enslaved to sin, and that we were freed from the grips of someone who did not want to let you go, from the prince of the power of the air, according to Ephesians chapter 2. That you were baptized not through the Red Sea, but baptized in the death of Jesus Christ, and are now being led by a ruler who you once rejected. Like it's the same story. And what you see with them is that the people were then given a law to govern how they ought to live as free people. And that they were given instructions for building a dwelling place for God, and that what God wanted servitude that was going to be given voluntarily. Does that sound familiar? That's you. That if you've been saved in the Lord, God has given you instructions. He's given you some laws on how you ought to live your life now as a freed person. And there's instructions, think about the end of Ephesians 2, 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 6, instructions on how to be a part of the dwelling place of God. And God wants you to do this voluntarily. And they were a people who longed, let's come back here one. Oh, we'll get there. There it is, look at that animation. That wasn't me, that was the guys in the back. It's much better than what I had. But they were a people who longed for a land where they could delight fully in God's goodness and in one another. And isn't that what you're looking for? Isn't that what you're longing for? So what happened to them? Because again, in Numbers chapter 13, they're at the foot of the land. They're getting ready to enter into the promised land. And something happens. In Numbers chapter 13, the text starts, the chapter starts, and it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send out for yourself men, so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of their fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them." Then in Numbers chapter 13, as the chapter begins, there's a few things that I think you need to see that's important to realize before the spies even go, before the leaders go even into the land. The first thing is that the land, notice how God describes the land in the text. In chapter 13, verse 2, God describes it as a land that he was going to give them. So regardless, I just want to make this very clear, regardless of what the report was, regardless of how the people felt about it, regardless of anything, here's the one fact that they should have had in mind. This land was a land that God was planning to give them. Like that was just a truth that they should have kept in mind. And when you go through the text, the guys that get chosen are leaders from every tribe. That these aren't nobodies. These are men who would have been known. I mean, you think about it. These are men with influence, men, their relatives, if there's one guy from every tribe, men with buy-in who want to be a part of that land. 12 guys from a group of 600,000 chosen mentioned in chapter 1. of Numbers. Like they're not just choosing Joe Schmo from across the street, and they're like, you want to come into the land? That's not how it was done. They're choosing the best possible guys to go. But let me tell you a fact that I think is important as well. In Deuteronomy, God actually says that this was completely unnecessary. They wanted this. God allows this to happen. God allows them to send spies into the land in Numbers. But in Deuteronomy, God actually, as they're recounting the story and he's reminding them about what happened, they didn't need to do this in the first place. They were already in position to enter into the land. God told them, do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed. But they wanted to investigate, and so God allowed them that opportunity. They wanted to go and see the geography regarding the land, but God had already promised them the land. So you need to keep that in mind, because they're going to go into the land, and notice what's going to happen. So the men will go into the land, and Moses will say, go spy it out. They're there for 40 days. When they come back, he also says, bring fruit with you. And here's the report. So they see the land, and in Numbers chapter 13, verse 25, when they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and to Aaron, to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Thus they told him, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So here's the report, by the way, and if you notice in your Bible, clearly I didn't read the whole report, but I stopped intentionally. Here's what the report should have been, period. End of discussion. Now we go into the land. They go, and what they see is they see what God had actually promised them. Could you imagine how they're feeling at this point? The majority of the nation, they haven't entered the land, but you have these 12 guys who got to see it. And they say, look at the fruit. And they say the land does flow with milk and honey. Everything that God said about the land has been true. How do you think they're feeling? Could you imagine the excitement? It's a split-second excitement, by the way, because the conversation continues. But could you imagine the excitement within them? We're not going to be in this wilderness forever. We are going to go into that land. God is going to make good on his promises. This is going to be so much better than we ever imagined. And up to this point, everything seems absolutely great. Until the 10 leaders then decide to give their commentary on the land. And the text continues and it says, nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. You drop down to verse 31, they say a few more things. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land, which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone in spying in and out, is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There we also saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are a part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight. So we were in their sight. You notice what happens for them from the report of the 10? It goes from them talking about the land to now it's not just talking about the land. What they start to say is they start to say some things. And I just want to ask you, true or false here? You can give me a little head nod. You can do this for true, this for false. True or false? Were the people of the land strong? True or false? The answer, yes. You don't know how you know this? He mentions multiple different people living within the land. You have to imagine these people were constantly fighting for dominance, constantly fighting for territory, which means the strongest people would have been surviving. Whoever was in the land at this point, these would have been the strongest people there, the strongest possible people in the land. And like the nation of Israel, how much military strength do they have? And for 400 years, they've been slaves. Like, it's not like they've been fighting wars. Like, they're not equipped for this sort of battle, you know? But that part is true, that the people were strong. True or false? Were the sons of Anak living there? And they get described as giants. But true or false? That's absolutely true as well. True or false? There were fortified cities in the land. True or false? Would you agree with these things? Like, are these facts that they would have seen there? Now let me ask you, fact or commentary? They are too strong for us. Was that a fact or was that a commentary that they were making? Fact or commentary? We are like grasshoppers in their sights. Was that a fact, like a definitive fact? Were they actually literally like, no. The land devours its inhabitants. And what you end up getting from the men is you end up getting their commentary. And their commentary is, we can't do this. The land devours its inhabitants. This is too big, which, by the way, isn't mentioned anywhere. It's not even what they say at first. All the people were men of great size. We were like grasshoppers. But do you notice where their focus is on? What are they thinking about? They're thinking about themselves. They're thinking about their might. They're thinking about their strength. They're thinking about how big the task is and how frail their capabilities were. We're smart. We can't accomplish this. And let me tell you what their focus was not on. It was not on the strength of God. They weren't focusing on the God who just made a sea split to let them cross through. They weren't focused on a God who was feeding them bread from heaven. They weren't focused on a God who showed them plagues to show them how strong he actually was. At some point, they stopped thinking about the power of God and they started to think about their own strength. And this was their conclusion. But have you ever done that? Have you ever thought about your Christianity and thought, I've got to do it with my own strength. I've got to do it by my own might, by my own talents, by my own goodness. Let me tell you, when you play that game real quick, you know what you start to realize? I'm not good enough. And I'm not strong enough. And I'm not going to that land. Like, that place is not a place that exists for me because I know me and I know how weak I actually am. And if we're not careful, I think that we can be dismayed as Christians just like they were. God has freed us from our captivity. You've been baptized. You have his word. And we're in a wilderness of sorts. You're not in the promised land, and you're also not living in your sin like you used to be. You're not in that slavery. We've been freed, and you're in a wilderness. And our truer, better Moses, Jesus, has promised to take us to our promised land. And sometimes we can be so disheartened about whether God is actually going to take us there or not. There's nothing like a disheartened Christian who thinks, I'm probably not going to heaven. We're going to see, by the way, how their discouragement ends up affecting the rest of the nation. But whenever you live your life as a Christian thinking, I'm not going to heaven, you don't think that's going to affect your day-to-day? You don't think it's going to affect your relationship with God? How much you're willing to pray, how much you're willing to pray, how much buy-in you have into all of this? Because you're thinking, I'm not getting there anyways. What does it matter anyways? That's their mentality here. That sometimes we can be the leaders, we can be the people who discourage other people about the realities of the promised land. Yeah, the land is great, but it's impossibly difficult to get there. Let me tell you, you probably won't get there. You don't explicitly say that. But too often Christians talk about Christianity in a more defeatist way than anybody else does. And that's to our shame. Because it completely nullifies the power of God and the grace of God. It completely nullifies the desire of God to have his people, have his children with him for an eternity. That if you think about your Christianity about like, well, as long as I die, like, and when I die, I like hadn't sinned, like the last thing, you know what I'm saying? Like there's like this fear like, all right, I gotta make sure I pray for forgiveness right now because if somehow I die in the middle of the night and the last thing I did is I was angry with this person, then God is probably gonna send me to hell. Like, that's an awful way to live your life. And I don't think that's the relationship that the Lord is looking to have with you. And that's not how he wants to, that's not how he wants you to think about your relationship with him. But then think about the report of the faithful. Because you have the 10 spies, and that's how they talk. But there were 12. There were 12 men who were sent into the land. And the two guys that you do remember, Joshua and Caleb, this is what they say. Caleb begins. He's the first person to talk in chapter 13. And in chapter 14, Joshua will say some things. But in chapter 13, this is in the midst of them saying, we can't go there. They're too great for us. We're never going to get there. Caleb quiets the people before Moses and says, we should, by all means, go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. And in chapter 14, Joshua speaks to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. Where the spies gave a bad report, Joshua says, this land is a good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Now let me ask you a very similar thing. The report from Joshua and Caleb. True or false? They were going to take possession of the land. True or false? I need a head nod, yes or no. True. Don't be afraid. If you say no, you're wrong, but that's okay. They were. True or false? They were going to overcome. This was their reality. That the people of the land, it didn't matter how big they were, it didn't matter what weapons they had, none of that mattered. They were going to be their prey. And this isn't some confident faith. This isn't some brass presumption that they have in them. What they have is they have confident faith in the Lord. Christians being confident in their relationship with God, Christians being confident with boldness coming before the throne of grace, you're not doing that being presumptuous. You're doing that because you have faith in God. For them, the root of all of this, the encouragement for all of this is going to happen if God is pleased. He will bring us into the land. It's not about my might. It's not about my strength. Imagine, in fact, think about how true this would have been for Joshua. As they enter into the promised land, the first thing they do is they get to this place called Jericho. And they're about to enter into the promised land. What do, by the way? They get all their swords and their bazookas and their grenades. And Joshua's, again, he goes for a lift. He's doing some squats. He's doing some push-ups right before he goes in. He's like, I'm just make sure I'm swole before I get in there. And you know what he does? He marches around the city every day for 6 days. And on the seventh day, they march around 7 times. And some guys then blow a trumpet. And the walls come down. What might did they show there? What strength was there in that? There was none. But you know what there was a lot of? Confidence in God. Faith that God, listen, none of this makes sense. I don't understand how doing this is gonna give us victory. But okay, he tells me to do it. You living your life isn't you thinking, well, the strength is in me. The sacrifices you make, the things that you do in trying to serve God. It's not about this is where my strength is found. It's rather this is what the Lord is asking me to do. And I've got faith that if I serve him, that he will be pleased with me. He will bring me into this land. The one thing he tells them to do is he says, only do not rebel against God. That their business was to, again, notice he says, don't fear them and don't rebel against God. You know what the opposite of that is? Fear God, don't fear the people, fear God and keep his commandments. That is the awe of man. That's what they should have done. That's what they should have had. That them conquering the land was never contingent on them. It was contingent on God. You getting into heaven is not contingent, let me tell you, on your strength and your might. Now, you will need to do some things, and they needed to do some things to get to that land. But the people's business was not the strength. The people's business was trusting God and obeying God. Let me tell you, both groups saw the same land. They saw the same challenges. It's not that Joshua and Caleb were blind to how large the men were. They saw the same things. They saw the same giants, and they responded differently. Why? We've already said this. The 10 focused on the giants. The 10 decided to spread fear. The 10 said, we can't, which ended up leading to death. Whereas Joshua and Caleb focused on God and spoke, seeking to inspire faith, knowing that God will. So which group are you in? Because we all see the same challenges. And we all have very similar struggles, though, maybe a little bit different, but for the most part, we deal with the same giants, same issues, same troubles. Which group are you a part of? Again, the 10 thought about their own strength and their might and their height, and it's never going to be good enough if that's what you're looking at. Whereas Joshua and Caleb thought about God's promises, and they thought about God's power. And so they hear it, and now the people get to choose. They're going to decide what they're going to do. Like, this is the report that they hear. They hear Joshua and Caleb's side. They hear the report of the 10 side, and they have to pick which ones are we going to be. And in Numbers chapter 14, verse 2, unfortunately, this is their response. All the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we have died in the land of Egypt, or would that we have died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it have not been better for us to return to Egypt? And think about what they say in verse 4. So they said to one another, let us appoint a leader. Let's just go back. Their solution, let's go back to slavery. You think Pharaoh, by the way, was going to be like, yay, I'm so happy to see you. Like, Pharaoh's kid died. His army was washed away. What do you think they were going to be met with when they went back? Open arms or worse punishment? If you ever decide to leave the Lord to go back, Where do you think you're going back to? You think you're going back to a world that loves you? A world that cares for you? A world that wants to have a relationship with you? What you're going back is to a ruler who hates you and will make you his slave, but he doesn't care about you. That's the only thing that we have going back. That's the only thing that they had going back. And listen, we should not underestimate the power of discouragement. Discouragement is an unbelievably powerful thing. Like at the end of all of this, their solution is to go back to slavery and go back to death. That was better for them than trusting in God, trusting in God's goodness, trusting that God would lead them through Canaan. And they lacked complete faith in God's salvation and care for them, even though God had already saved them. They wished that they could die. Let me tell you why discouragement is such a terrible thing. Because discouragement will paint doubts about God in your mind. That you'll look back at your life and you'll doubt everything God has done. You'll look at your present and you'll doubt everything that God is doing. And you'll look ahead at the future and you'll doubt everything that God will do. See how powerful that is? It's just words that they said to them. It's just discouragement. And it paints everything. They forget about everything that God had done for them. They look at their situation and they forgot about the manna. They forgot about all the ways in which God was taking care of them. And so they look ahead and they say, there's no way we can do this. That's the power of doubt in your mind. That's the power of discouragement in your life. You get that instead of trusting in God's word, they resolved to go back to Egypt. That disbelief in the text here isn't, I just want to be clear, like, do you think that they don't believe in God? So in the very next verse, we didn't read it. God says, I'm going to punish them for their disbelief. Do they not believe that God exists? Of course they do. Like, they've seen his power. They understand all of that. Disbelief in Numbers chapter 14 is not believing that God is going to accomplish what he said he would. You need to understand that, like, there's a lot of Christians who don't believe in God. That you believe that God exists. Because all the evidence is there. And you're not dumb. Like, you know. There was a man in Israel named Jesus of Nazareth who existed. And I heard the stories and I believe that he existed. I believe that he died. I believe that I'm in sin. But I don't believe that I'm going to heaven. And here, God views that as disbelief. A disbelief manifests itself in far more ways than we're oftentimes willing to admit. And so the voices of 10 fearful people ended up dooming an entire generation. Now, I want to be clear, by the way. What I mean by discouragement isn't acknowledging or confronting sin. That's not discouraging. If you're in sin and somebody acknowledges it, you can't be like, well, you're just discouraging me. No, they're actually helping you. Let's not confuse the two things. You know, someone coming to you and confronting your sin is not discouraging. In fact, not saying anything would be discouraging. That would be equally harmful and disadvantageous to you. What I mean by discouraging and discouragement is when we talk to people in a way that makes it seem like serving God is impossible. You'll never change. You'll always be stuck in that place. That sin that you're dealing with, that'll always be you. That's discouraging. Discouragement is when we behave like we don't believe that we'll enter into the promised land. And I'm a Christian, but I behave like everybody else in the world does. That's discouraging. You ever met Christians who they post all the right things and they post all the right Bible verses on social media? And you're like, I know how this person actually talks, and I know how they actually live, and I know who they actually are. That's discouragement. The discouragement is when we talk like, well, we're all just sinners anyway, so who cares? You can't actually obey God, and you can't expect me to do it either. That's discouragement. And my point is that discouragement is critical. And so what are the voices that make you doubt in God's promises? Because they had 10, but really, that's just the culmination of a lot of little voices they'd been listening to for a long time. That the nation of Israel constantly was susceptible to listening to voices that were telling them God is not going to accomplish what he said he would. And too often we are people who listen to voices that tell us God will not accomplish what he ultimately said he would in your life. And they listen to the voice of fear. That God, listen, I mean, they're just afraid. Why did you bring us out? Look at Pharaoh's army constantly, over and over again. This is the conversation. They're afraid. They're going to kill us. That's why we even said, don't even take us out of our slavery. We were better there. And they're so irrational. Their conclusion is God brought us out to kill us. Now, again, obviously I'm not God, but like, if the end goal was to kill you, why even bother saving you in the first place? You get what I'm saying? It makes no sense. You're already going to die in the land in which you're in. Why bother saving you? If God's goal for you is to ultimately not save you, why send his son to die? What sense does it make? Why show you love? Why care for you at all if what he actually desires for you is your perdition? You see how it actually doesn't make any sense? But we let irrationality creep into our minds and creep into our hearts, and we start saying, well, it's probably just not going to happen. And again, isn't that the report that sometimes we allow ourselves to listen to? Yeah, God will probably save them. You know them, the super Christians. The preachers and the elders and their wives and the deacons. If you keep progressing in the right way, I'm liking the way you're going. Some of you, I don't, you know. But the rest of us, just regular average Christians, I just don't know about us. I don't know if he's going to save me because I'm not good enough. As if your goodness was ever going to be good enough. The fact that you needed salvation implied you're not good enough. Because I don't know enough. As if there's going to be some test on the last day and God's going to be like, all right. In Jeremiah, my Bible's upside down. This is a familiar passage. Hang on. Let's go to Daniel chapter 8 and let's talk about the vision of the ram and the goat. That's a joke. Don't actually go there. I'm glad you're paying attention. Now tell me, what does the ram mean? Let's talk about the 70 weeks. What is this like? Like we think like, well, if it's going to be some test, and if I don't know all the right answers, then maybe I'm not going to be saved. Like that's how you were going to be saved. Because I don't have some talents that other people have here. Like you're going to impress your way into heaven. It's never been about any of that. And listen, some of you are trying your absolute best to serve God. And you know it and he knows it. And sometimes we still feel like I won't be there. I'm not perfect. And what if I've been faithful to God my whole life and then I was angry and had a heart attack and that's how I died? Do you believe that God went through all this work that you've read about in the scriptures just to punish you? He desires your salvation. But sometimes we listen to the voice of fear. Sometimes we listen to the voice of discomfort. In Numbers chapter 11, they complained. In fact, they complained the whole time. If they had a song, it's a song of complaint. Because it's always everything. Well, my life, back in Egypt, we remember when we had cucumbers and garlics and leeks and melons and slavery and the death of our children and we didn't have our own land and life was actually pretty terrible and we had to work all day. Oh, hang on, not that part. But we remember all the good that we had. And now in this wilderness, life is so hard and it's so uncomfortable. And how often do we think about Christianity and all you think about is the discomfort? Did they want the land that flowed with milk and honey? Absolutely. Of course they did. But in between Egypt and that land was a wilderness. And now I've spent let me count days, 0 days of my life camping. But I would imagine, those of you who for some reason like to do that stuff, it's not super comfortable. You're in a house. Why go to a tent? It makes no sense. Whatever. Let's not get past the point. But it's not super. But even that, you'll do it for a few days. They did it for 40 years. That's uncomfortable. They wouldn't have liked it. They wouldn't have enjoyed it. It definitely wasn't pleasant. There were parts that felt unbearable. They complained about water, complained about bread, complained about everything. And isn't that the report that sometimes the voice that we oftentimes allow ourselves to hear? Listen, now that I'm a Christian, I feel like I'm hard-pressed at every side. My family now disagrees with the ways in which I'm living my life. I'm trying to truly serve up Christ, and people just keep bringing up different challenges, asking me different questions at work, with my friends, with how I was, my life used to be a lot easier, a lot better before I did this Jesus stuff. And now I'm trying to serve Christ, and everything seems hard at every side. And that's the voice of discomfort talking to you, telling you just give up. Wouldn't it be easier if you went back to Egypt? I don't fit in society. And listen, Christianity is going to feel like a wilderness. Like leaving an awful, though familiar world behind while you wait to go to heaven where your citizenship actually relies. But don't forget why you left Egypt in the first place. Don't forget why you were baptized. Don't forget why you decided to start serving Jesus Christ. It's because you know that back there is nothing for you. And that world is far more uncomfortable than you're willing to remember. And they listen to the voice of the majority. We already read these verses, but we won't read it again. But they listen to the voice of 10 instead of the voice of 2. The 10 voices drowned out 2. And human nature favors the crowd. That's just kind of how we are, even when the crowd is wrong. Because oftentimes we think the majority has to be right. If everybody, 70% of y'all stood up and started to walk outside. The other 30% of you, though you would have no idea why they stood up, you would get up as well. And you start walking outside as well. Because that's just what we are. By human nature, we follow what everybody else is doing. This is the current. This is where they're going. So this has to be right. The majority does not create truth. God does. The majority does not dictate what is right. God does. And half of the nation of Israel could have said, we're not going to get into that land. And it wouldn't have mattered because God said that they were. God made that promise. God told them that they were going to be able to do this. Do not be swept away in the thinking of the masses, in what the masses think about Jesus, and what the masses think about what church is and how church should be operated. The masses do not determine truth. In fact, the only reason why Joshua and Caleb were worth listening to wasn't because of who they were, it was because they were saying what God ultimately said. They were just repeating God's words. That's why what they said was true. And ultimately, they did not listen to God. And they heard the voices, they heard every other voice, except the one voice that mattered. You have a lot of voices telling you a lot of things. But whose report will you heed? Whose voice are you going to listen to? Because there's voices within telling you, I'm not good enough. And even if today, at this moment, I tried to come forward and change my life, I'm probably not going to change. That's not God's voice talking to you. And if it's not God's voice, ultimately it's the voice of the enemy who desires something else for you. What they should have listened to was God's voice. In Hebrews 3, we won't read these verses for the sake of time. But in Hebrews 3:12 through chapter 4, verse 2, the Hebrew writer makes mention of this time. And he said that they did not heed God's voice, and so they died in the wilderness. But if they had heard God's voice, they would have entered into that land. And so he says to them, today, are you willing to listen to God's voice? Are you willing to quiet and put down every other voice that's telling you otherwise? Because there is a place that exists. A place that God wants you to be a part of. A place that gets described as a new heaven and a new earth. Not Canaan, far better than that. A place where the tabernacle of God is among men. We mentioned earlier that what makes the best of the things is Jesus. The best of this place is that God is there. He will dwell among them. God himself will be among them. 3 times he lets you know in verse 3. There's a place that exists where God is there perfectly. And like we sang at the beginning, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne says, "Write, for these words are faithful and true." Do you believe that this place exists? Do you believe that if you've been baptized for the forgiveness of your sins and you've lived your life in faith in Jesus Christ, that God will ultimately make good on his promises? In just a moment, we're going to sing "Dare to Stand Like Joshua." And as you sing the song, you're going to stand up and sing. But as you sing this song, ask yourself, am I standing like Joshua against everybody else, against every other voice that says anything else? Me and my house, will we serve the Lord, even if no one else does? Let's stand and sing.
We